will be fun today. Welcome, everybody. I'm Ira Winderman from the South Florida Sun Sentinel, out here in Fort Lauderdale, trying to figure out what the hell is going on with the Heat. He's Kurt Helin from Pro Basketball Talk, NBCSports.com, out in LA on a 3-hour time delay, trying to figure what the hell is going on with the Heat. And this is Inside the Paint, brought to you by RedRecover.com. You can click all over here on the website for updates from them. You can smash like buttons on the Big O Show. You can chime in our chat on our YouTube, so it'll be getting this for sure. I'm not sure where to start today because I did not think, Kurt, after what we saw against the Boston Celtics, a dynamic game on Friday night, some of the best of Jimmy Butler, his baskets in overtime, what the Heat did, and you said to yourself, that's the Heat team we've been expecting now for 6 weeks, a team that steps up to challenges. Then you go in Memphis, play the Grizzlies on Monday. They sit everyone from Desmond Bane, John Morant, Jaren Jackson Jr., only Steven Adams among the starters in the starting lineup. The Heat lose there. Come home against a Detroit team without Cade Cunningham and no reason to play up for anything other than a lottery pick. The Heat lose by 20 to them. So, Kurt, I guess I'm going to start with this. Is this just another stumble in the first third of the season with more to come, or is this a greater sign of the Heat are not an it team? The Heat are closer to play-in or lottery than playoffs. Is this a point of ultimate concern, or is this just, I've seen it 1,000 times before. This happens to team. They're still better than the Knicks. They're better than the Bulls. They're better than the play-in group. What's the outside take here, Kurt?
The thing is, I wish I had some sort of definitive answer here, but like that Friday game threw me off, the win over the Celtics, because that was the team nobody wants to see in the playoffs, right? Like that's the team.
Yes.
Like Jimmy Butler being physical, getting to his spots, the switchability of Bam, the role players. Like you watch that team and you're like, yeah, that team's a threat. That team's a problem. And then just, I don't, is it a lack of depth is what I'm beginning to wonder. Is it the fact that you only have Jimmy Butler, if Jimmy Butler or Tyler Hero isn't creating the offense, it's not there. They just don't seem to have other guys. They don't have, whether it's not playing the system or obviously Kyle Lowry's not kind of been that guy. They just don't, if it's not one of those two last night against Detroit, if it wasn't Tyler Bam pick and roll, it didn't work. It was horrible. Yeah. And I fear that it is maybe right now, at least as the way they're playing, they're more lottery. And it doesn't, the good news is they're 2.5 games out of the 4 seed. Like it doesn't feel lost.
Right.
But boy, it's just, you watched last night. It's hard to pitch that, hey, plenty of time thing. Does it feel hard to pitch that right now?
It does. And again, even when you look at the standings, as much as you might be still, you're close enough. You're not close enough to Milwaukee or Boston. So you're not close enough for contention for something legitimate. In 11th, you're not even in the play-in right now. But ladies and gentlemen, this is why at one point Kurt Helin was my editor at the good old days of MSNBC Sports, because I think he's spot on with the depth thing. Now, you can say depth is always compromised by injury. And if you have Jimmy Butler out there last night, instead of load management, rest, knee recovery, whatever they want to call it, you have much more depth to play through your rotation. All of a sudden, guys, Max Strus, second unit, you have a different approach. But I think, Kurt, what you hit on depth is right there for this reason. You have a team that's only carrying 14 players on the standard roster instead of 15 because of the luxury tax. You have a team trying to do the altruistic or good thing and carry Udonis Haslem on the roster because they want to get him his 20th season, even though he barely plays. You have a team that was willing to work through 2 months of recovery, and we'll get to this later in the show about Victor Oladipo's return also. But this is a team. You're correct. We saw it last night. They could not afford to have Hero and Bam both on the floor, let alone one of the two of them going off the floor. There's not a lot there. And you could say, wait a minute, Ira. They also didn't have Gabe Vincent and Dwayne Dedmon. Well, let's not kid ourselves. Neither of those two has been particularly good this season either. Dwayne Dedmon has been very up and down, slowed either by age or by the plantar fasciitis in his foot. Gabe Vincent has been slowed by the type of knee injury that when you're in and out and in and out, you wonder if at a certain point you would not be shocked to see the press release that they've shut down Gabe Vincent. He's undergone a procedure. He'll be out for X amount of time. So those two aren't walking through the door. So I agree about the depth. And I just posted a story at sunsentinel.com about this. And so I'll ask you about this. And I know you might not have seen every play or been so into it, but is the return of Victor Oladipo enough? Or is that, again, grasping at straws of a player who's been limited by injury now for the last 4.5 seasons?
It might be grasping a little bit. It's obviously too early to tell. He looked a little rusty last night, but he's, like you said, with all the time he's missed, I thought he looked okay. He got to the line a few times, but you kind of have to. Like, you look at him now, I don't want to savior is a strong word, but you need his depth. You need him to come through and be able to play 20 solid minutes a night right now, but for the reasons you mentioned. They're not necessarily getting it from everyone else.
Yeah, it's a point right now that you might say to yourself, hey, when Jimmy is healthy and everyone's healthy, you can work through the depth. But you have to build better depth when you have a point guard who is 36 and you have a leading man in Jimmy Butler who is 33, and when you don't have that youthful vitality off the bench. And here's the problem. They let Caleb Martin go in the offseason. They let PJ Tucker go in the offseason. So you had to move Energizer Caleb Martin from the bench into the starting lineup. They made a 4-year, $130 million extension commitment to Tyler Hero. Requisite with that, seemingly, is moving him into the starting lineup. So these two dynamic elements that you had coming off the bench last season, the energizers, the game changers, exactly what you want on the bench, are in your starting lineup. Only they have to be subordinate to Bam Adebayo, to Jimmy Butler, and to Kyle Lowry, your sort of leading men there, so they don't get to be that energizer. Kurt, it's interesting because on one hand as a coach, you don't want to show panic because that's when all could be lost.
Yeah.
On the other hand, sometimes you have to step forward and make the hard decision that might not please players. So, at 11-14, still just 25 games into an 82-game season, not quite at the one-third mark of the season, does Erik Spoelstra, or should Erik Spoelstra, consider returning either Caleb Martin or Tyler Hero or both to the second unit to get better balance when whole? Or do you say, hey, that's a panic move. That's too early to change the entire plan of the offseason, July, August, September, of training camp in September and October, and all of a sudden, boom, here you are, December 7th, and you're saying this isn't right, and you're recalibrating and resetting. So how would you look at that possibility from Erik Spoelstra of the reset, of resetting the starting lineup of the bench, or is that still a little bit too much of panic when you don't want to show panic?
You're 11-14, literally, and then the 11 seed. It's time for everything to be on the table, right?
Okay.
I don't think you're in a position to not. I don't know if you go there yet, but I think you've got to consider everything. I think my second question though is, I'm like, that makes sense. I love the idea of Tyler Hero and Caleb Martin coming off the bench. Then who starts? Like, I mean, are you still giving up something on that front end? And especially on the nights Jimmy is out, like we said,
right,
you need that shot creation. Tyler would have to move into the starting lineup those nights, but it sounds great, but the depth issue comes back of like, all right, well then who do we plug in that's as good at, or can fill the Tyler Caleb roles? And I'm not sure who that is.
And that's the thing with the limited depth, and maybe the Victor Oladipo return gives you that dynamic play off the bench. Here's the thing, though. I think Victor Oladipo still can be a skilled player. I don't think you lose that. I think when you're a former All-Star, when you're former third-team All-NBA, you have that innate ability. I don't see him as an energizer. I see him more sort of in NBA terms in you and my age group, as far as takes a little while to get up in the morning, especially you starting our RedRecover.com Inside the Paint show at 6 a.m. out there in Los Angeles time. Victor Oladipo is not that dynamic. Inject him in. Oh, the Heat are struggling. Here comes our sixth man. He's waiting by the scorer's table. He's coming in.
Right.
That's an over expectation for a Victor Oladipo at this point, isn't it?
Yeah, he's not. I mean, there are those microwave scorers out there. Jordan Clarkson did it for Utah. Has done it for a while. Obviously, going back a little, Lou Williams and Jamal Crawford won 6 men awards, coming in just dropping those. But that's not who he is. That's not. I mean, that's not the kind. Victor Oladipo's game is a little more rounded than being the unrepentant gunners that we're kind of talking about here.
Yes.
Like, so I don't want to say you don't get something from him that he can't bring depth, but he doesn't bring that kind of energy change the same way.
Yeah, I think so also. As a matter of fact, today I want to do the show a little bit differently. I really want to let the listeners chime in here on redrecover.com inside the paint. So I am spending some time. So I'm not glancing off camera at you, Kurt. I'm trying to check the chat board here also.
I don't like to look at me either. So I'm good.
Okay, it makes 2 of us there. And that's why the podcast is just a beautiful thing. Although I think with how fast I talk, if you try to play me on 1.5 times speed, we're all going to be in trouble. Oh, it's like a coffee jolt in the morning. So I want to go to the chat board here if I can get this all called up. Just some quick thoughts on the quick thoughts, if you don't mind. Greater Good goes, I got no answers, but Spo is working on it. I think we all agree that Eric Spoelstra is an elite level NBA coach. Yes. He came in last night. He basically says, we're not going to panic. We're going to find a way. Kurt, does Eric Spoelstra have enough tools to be the best possible Eric Spoelstra?
That's actually a great way of putting it, because we like to think, oh my gosh, Greg Popovich did all this brilliant stuff. And so, I mean, still a great coach, but did all this brilliant stuff with the Spurs every year. Yeah. Did you see his bench? Did you see the, it's great when I'm like, we can talk Manu into coming off the bench. You have to have the tools. And I am less as great as I believe. I believe he's the best coach in the NBA right now. As much as I love what Spo does, if you're the chef, you can only cook with the ingredients you were given. And I'm not sure he has. I'm with you. I'm not sure that it's there.
Yeah, no, I agree with that also. Chase goes, they basically have the same squad as the Eastern Conference final team. What the hell is going on? I think the loss of PJ Tucker is a factor there also. But I think you always have to grow as a team. Here's the opposite. Old teams get older. It's just a reality. Kurt, have we seen the Miami Heat get old in front of our very eyes with their 36-year-old point guard and 33 in Kyle Lowry and their 33-year-old leading man in Jimmy Butler?
A little bit. I mean, they've still got the energy of Bam Adebayo and Tyler Hero, but if we're talking about Jay Crowder a bunch this year, and they the Suns moving on, they moved on because we've got this young dynamic kid in Cameron Johnson. We can move into the starting lineup. I'm not sure where the Heat have that youthful. There's just not as much youthful athleticism off the bench.
That's a fantastic point. Then when you looked at the Heat bench, you're saying, well, we still have 30-year-old Victor Oladipo we could put in there. We have 33-year-old Dwayne Dedmon, who was out last night. And here's the other part of that equation. I will get back to the chat board. I know we got a ton of stuff here, so smash like buttons. We'll get to you right here. Is when you look at the Heat, those are the older elements of the bench. The younger elements of the bench, right now, the way it's setting up, are Gabe Vincent and Max Strus. Are those just guys? In other words, every team in the NBA has 9th and 10th men. And those 9th and 10th men help, but they don't necessarily move the needle. Do we overstate Gabe Vincent and Max Strus when they look so good playing with other great players? But when we put them on the second unit and ask them to be leading men, are we overstating and maybe putting too much on their plates?
You know how ill it makes me to speak poorly of Gabe Vincent, but Gabe Vincent's a nice rotation player. Max Strus maybe slightly more than that, but ultimately is just a good rotation player. And you nailed it, by the way. You've got to have those guys. You've got to have depth. Both of those guys can step up and give you nights, give you experience, but I don't know that they're. Yeah, I think that's a good term. In the NBA parlance, they're guys. They're call them 7, call them 8, call them 9. But if they're in your top 5 or 6, you're getting more concerned. Strus maybe can fit in the. And again, it's situational. Like it's always a matter of fit. But yeah, I think it's a valid point, Ira.
Greater Good says Lowry definitely didn't respond to the urgency to get in shape. He gets a lot of minutes, and you see the decline in his game. Kurt, at a certain point, one, aren't you what you are?
Yeah.
Two, when you're older, you become an older player. Kyle Lowry's body type was never not this. He was always able to play with the body that he has, overcome it with his guile and his savvy and everything else. So I would not say in any way that Kyle Lowry's in worse shape. He's healthier. Look, Kyle Lowry is the only player on the Miami Heat who has appeared in every game. He is playing huge minutes to the point that as of last week, he was number 2 in the NBA in total minutes. Thankfully, now he's down to number 9 because Jimmy Butler, Tyler Hero are back. They've eased that load. I would say this. When they always, I know it's the bad cliche, availability is the best ability. But I think of all the Heat concerns when you're talking about, I think to lump and pile on like we did in the offseason on Kyle Lowry is not fair at this point, no matter what Greater Good says here. What say Kurt Helin?
He like you said, he's shown up, and I don't think he's been bad. I think he's been okay. Look, if you're looking for peak Toronto Kyle Lowry, he's just, I don't think he's that guy.
No, because you're not going to get the same player with 36 you have at 35. I mean, that championship that they won in Toronto was 3 years ago. 3 years in the NBA can be a lifetime for players.
Yeah.
How many players have we seen 1, 2, 3 years later? They're simply not the same player. So if you have those expectations, and here's the point that Big O always makes with that. I think that he did have those expectations with Kyle. When at 35, they gave him the 3-year, $85 million contract. But you can't base it all on the contract. I think Kyle Lowry is a slower, older player who can get by on guile and savvy. But as Kurt and I have said here in RedRecover.com inside the paint now for weeks, he's probably average to below average, with average being number 15 of the 30 NBA starting point guards right now. So when he plays above that, he's almost overachieving. Right, Kurt?
Yeah, he's a solid, at this point in his career, he's just a good, solid starting point guard, but that only gets you so far, right? I think you're right. I think the Heat expected, we'll call it a big 3, but like him to be more dynamic than that. And it's just, with you, I don't think it's a question of him showing up in shape. I don't think it's a question of desire. Outside of what LeBron says to Jason Momoa, Father Time ultimately wins these races, man. Like, you it's just hard. You know, I don't think he's playing poorly. I just think this, like you said, isn't this who he is at this point?
And I agree. When we come back from this break on RedRecover.com Inside the Paint, I do want to talk to Kurt a little bit about what's a league-wide issue also. We saw it hit home last night with the Heat, with Jimmy Butler being given a third of the way into the season, a night off after they had a 2-day break for load management. And if that almost becomes the crutch for coaches, if that almost becomes the expectations, and as Kurt's going to research during this 90-minute or so commercial break, in what other aspect of work can you make $400,000 for a work day and say, you know what, just pay me, I'm not showing up? So Kurt will give us a few life lessons on that after this break on RedRecover.com Inside the Paint. And we're back on RedRecover.com Inside the Paint. I'm Ira Winderman from the South Florida Sun Sentinel. He's Kurt Helin from NBCSports.com, Pro Basketball Talk. Kurt, before the break, I spoke about the whole load management thing and how the NBA has become just the way it is. We're seeing it on a bunch of teams. The Heat will face the Clippers on Thursday. And a matter of fact, you might have more insight on this. We'll get to it later in the show when we talk about our upcoming Heat schedule. The Heat are getting the Clippers on the second night of a back-to-back on Thursday. The Clippers are playing Orlando tonight. So we're already in that. Do they play Kawhi and Paul George tonight? Did they sit them and play them in Miami? Are they ambulatory enough to play in either game at the time they missed? So you have that. So I want to walk people back through what I think was the Heat mindset over the weekend. Jimmy Butler comes back on Friday night in Boston. Eric Spoelstra says before the game, we're not playing Jimmy Butler 40 minutes after he missed 7 with knee soreness. So he plays him 35 because they go overtime. He has to. Jimmy's fantastic in the overtime. Makes 2 unreal shots. It's all on him. You see why he's still one of the game's preeminent closers in that final extra period in Boston and what he can do. They then have 2 days off. Jimmy feels comfortable enough with his travel schedule. He stays in Boston with Kyle Lowry and Anthony Carter. Anthony Carter's son plays for Providence Friars. They go to see him play in that game on Saturday. They travel to Memphis. It's a leisurely approach. All is good. I thought from the get-go, the Heat would look at the back-to-back and say, okay, how are we going to spot our guys? Who are we going to play in the first game? Who are we going to play in the second game? It's weird, Kurt, but that's where we are in back-to-backs in the NBA. Veteran players rarely, not to say rarely, that's overstated it, do not always play both ends of back-to-backs. Then the Heat gets the word out of Memphis after Memphis plays Detroit on Sunday. They're going to sit John Morant. They're going to sit Jaren Jackson Jr. They're going to sit Desmond Bane. They're going to sit anyone and everyone. My thought was the Heat then say, you know what? Let's get the sure W. That Memphis team is awful.
Yeah.
We'll play Kyle. We'll play Jimmy Butler. We'll go all out. And then we got this bad Detroit team on Tuesday. So they go out, they play everyone, and they're just terrible. And they lose the game in Memphis. All of a sudden Tuesday, yesterday, you wake up and you see Jimmy Butler's on the injury report. And you see he's being held out because of load management, rehabilitation for the soreness on the knee. I think from the get-go, the Heat were deciding which of the game Jimmy would play and wouldn't play. I have no issue with that. I thought it might be the same case with Kyle Lowry. Don't want to be too long-winded here. But I look at the injury report during the day yesterday and I see Kyle Lowry's questionable with ankle soreness. In the NBA, they don't like a player from going from not being on the injured report at all to suddenly he's out.
Yeah.
There's the gambling element and all of that. They call stepping it up. Go ahead, list a player as questionable, as doubtful, as out. The gambling people know there's something going on here. The line doesn't move dramatically. I have no issue with that. But then the Heat find out Gabe Vincent's not available because that knee soreness is back after he missed 5 of 6 games, came back for 3 games. So Kyle Lowry has to go out and play in both games anyway. Long-winded, but getting to this point, finally here, I'll exhale. Kurt, even though the Heat came to an agreement with Jimmy Butler that he probably would sit out one of the 2 games, even though it was decided that the Detroit game on Tuesday would be his load management day, his day off, do you reach a point where a game becomes too important and you have to tell that player, hey, suck it up, give us what you can. That was not the result we expected in Memphis, but now we're in a different situation. Or, and I think if the Heat are listening, and I do believe they monitor the show, would they say, are you an imbecile, Ira? It's December 6th, the game that they played last night against the Detroit Pistons. Are you going to push Jimmy to the point in December where he's not going to be ready or ailing in March, April, and they hope, of course, May? Kurt, should the Heat have rethought the approach there, or am I being way too dramatic here on redrecover.com Inside the Paint on a Wednesday morning day after?
I think, look, I don't think you're being too dramatic in the sense that this team, again, when we talked about before, if just the lack of urgency, the lack of, like, you can't lose that Memphis game. Like, if you're targeting that as the must win, right? Like, hey, we're going to play all our guys and they don't have Ja and Desmond and everybody else and Dylan, you got to get that game. You can't give that game up. And then if you don't, I think it's fair to, hey, we need you. I think it also depends on your relationship. Spo has to have this relationship with Jimmy and know where they can go, or you end up with Nate McMillan and Trae Young and
perfect
all that mess. Like, you've got to have a guy who would be willing to do it in a relationship where the coach can go in and go, hey, we need this from you tonight. Can you give me this and not get, I don't want to say Jimmy's blown up in the past, but like you've got to be able to keep him happy too. And that's not an easy line to walk.
No, that's a really good point. It's not like the Heat, when they added Jimmy Butler, got a player with no baggage and no history. They saw how it played out with Fred Hoiberg in Chicago. They saw how it played out with Tom Thibodeau and, to probably a greater degree, Rachel Nichols in Minnesota. They saw how even when he was within a Kawhi Leonard shot of instead his Sixers going to the Eastern Conference Finals, he still walked away from the 76ers for his Heat contract. They knew all that. They knew the baggage. They knew what came with it. I get all that. Again, during this last commercial break here on redrecover.com Inside the Paint, I did go outside as usual. I always do, and chase the kids off the lawn. So I get that. I get that's who I am, and that's the age group that I'm at. But Kurt, the Heat also went above and beyond for Jimmy Butler. They gave him a contract extension through his 36th birthday that is going to pay in excess, combined with the year he had left, of $200 million. They are paying him a salary of about $400,000 per game, whether he plays or whether he doesn't. Doesn't the obligation change when someone makes that commitment to you, that the commitment should be to play through pain and soreness? And the reason I bring it up is this. I had asked Eric Spoelstra about Kyle Lowry's minutes. We were out in Boston last week. And I said, this guy's number 2 in minutes in the NBA at 36 years old. Aren't you concerned? And he said, look, we don't practice anymore. We're not pushing guys on the off day. Every single non-game day is a recovery day. We're giving the guys the chance to get their body right. This is not Pat Riley. Matter of fact, this is not Eric Spoelstra with his, he calls them Hunger Games practices. You have to be padded up. You have to be ready for contact. You're going to get bruised, and it's going to go for a while. They don't do that anymore. They're smart with their older players. So doesn't a player at a $400,000 pay grade have to be a little bit different with his approach? Or again, is that your body is your temple, and your body tells you when you can and when you can't? And the examples I'm going to bring up to you out there, Kurt, out in Los Angeles isn't that sort of the approach that Kawhi Leonard has taken ever since the championship in Toronto, or even while he was winning the championship in Toronto, is salary don't matter. Victory doesn't matter. I know my body. I know how I feel, just like we know our bodies. And everyone out there watching RedRecover.com Inside the Paint knows there's certain mornings you swing the legs off the side of the bed and you say, yeah, it's not happening today. You know, or that's why they have them little blue pills and other things out there for that reason. I can't do it on my own today. So, Kurt, should we just accept Jimmy, that forget the pay grade, it is what it is? Or is it reasonable for Miami Heat fan, Miami Heat Nation to expect the player to suck it up a little more when so much has already been given?
I think the Kawhi Leonard comparison with Jimmy is good in that Kawhi's a little different. And well, you know better than I am with Jimmy, like how much Kawhi's got his own team of guys, right? Like
as Jimmy does, and that's why Jimmy stayed back in Miami. And I was wondering, wait, Eric Spoelstra is saying it's good to have Victor Oladipo on the road, even though he's not playing, because it's good to be around the team. It's good to show support of the team. It's good to build that camaraderie. And yet you can make the same thing for Jimmy, and Jimmy is showing videos on his Instagram of being with his entire team, with his skills trainer, with everyone back in Miami on the court and working. I'm never questioning whether Jimmy is working or putting in the time. Then Jimmy comes back against Boston, and Jason Jackson, the Heat sideline reporter, is in the locker room. And he says, Jimmy, what delivered you to the point where you could play in overtime and hit game winners against Boston? And Jimmy listed name after name after name, all of his own people. The Heat had plenty of dedicated people back in Miami. The Heat have a dedicated training staff. But it was all about Jimmy's people. It was almost unfair, I thought, to the effort the Heat staff is putting in, but that's the way it is. So, yes, he has his own people. He listens to his own people. But the last time I checked, Jimmy is paying his own people. The Heat are paying Jimmy $400,000 a game. The Heat gave Jimmy that contract extension. I know for a fact Jimmy still feels like he's underpaid because that's just how NBA players are. That's how Jimmy feels. But shouldn't there sort of be it both ways of the Heat, hey, the going is tough. We don't want to have to ask you to push through, but we need you to push through. And I think they're a little careful on that. And shouldn't there be something on the other side? Or is Jimmy shown that Jimmy Butler Inc., Jimmy Butler Incorporated, is simply its own business that works as a subsidiary? Dwayne Wade and players.
Well, I agree. I do think. By the way, I like the subsidiary of his coffee company. I would get in on that one, especially this early in the morning out here.
Hello.
They've got Kawhi and Jimmy have the same mentality with their people in this sense. To me, they don't think they're getting. I don't want to say they don't think they're getting paid for December, but that's not what they see where they earn their money. It's April. It's May. It's March. It's big games and big moments, and this is about getting them to that point. But I think you hit the nail on the head, which is the Heat at, again, 11-14 have to find a way to turn that around faster. They cannot do – the Clippers 14-12 now. I think they were 14-11. I'm not sure off the top of my head. You've got a little more cushion, right? You've got a little more ability to wait, especially because nobody has done what Boston, Milwaukee have done and run away with the West. I guess Phoenix a little, but they're much more comfortable being patient. I'm not sure, like, how much longer can the Heat be patient, Ira? Like, how much longer?
And that's the exact next point I want to get you to. A lot of times these, whether it's 538 or other projections, they'll list through their computer analysis what the team likely will finish with. But a lot of times those also have best possible finish, worst possible finish.
Yeah.
So let's look at the Eastern Conference right now. And let's look at best possible finish. Maybe the Heat find one of those win 10 out of 13. Even though this was horrible last night, the Heat are in the soft spot of their schedule. We'll get to the schedule in our final segment here on redrecover.com Inside the Paint. But the schedule is favorable, even if the Heat might not maximize it. Best case Heat scenario on December 7th as we sit here and project out to the future. What, looking at Milwaukee, at Boston, at whether you want to consider Brooklyn and Philadelphia and the other teams, honestly, Kurt Helin from Pro Basketball Talk and NBCSports.com. What's the best possible outcome you see for the Heat in the NBA Eastern Conference standings based on what you see now and based on your ultimate glass not only full but overflowing projection?
I think the highest they can go is 4. I don't think anybody's catching Boston, Milwaukee, and frankly, Cleveland is legit.
Okay.
Like they're at least for the regular season, I don't think you're catching them, and we can have the playoff debate with them later. But I think that those are going to be your top 3. But I think I said this earlier. They're 2.5 games back of Atlanta at the 4 spot, and the Hawks aren't blowing anybody's doors off.
Right.
You've got a bunch of teams to jump is the concern. Like even if you win 10 of 13 and you get on this run, you still got to jump Philadelphia and, like you said, Brooklyn and some teams that might start to, Philadelphia got Harden back and lost the first one, but we'll see if that juices them a little bit in their offense.
And then Maxey will come back also. Sure.
Right. So I think the 4 seed is, you're not so far out of it that it's unrealistic, but it's a lot to ask considering how many teams they have to jump. And it might be, I think making 5 or 6, getting into the playoffs and not having to go into play-in should be very much the realistic goal. I think that you can get there.
And that's a good point.
You've got to win some games.
That's a good point. And because I've also covered the Heat during the low ebb, or as we like to call it here, the Kasib Powell, Stefan Lasme, Blake Ahern era, I've always looked at the standings a different way. In the old days, in olden times, I've always said there are 15 teams in the East, 7 don't make the playoffs. Who are those 7? So I can figure the Heat are in the playoffs. Now it's a little bit different because, in effect, 10 make the playoffs, counting the play-in game. So the first thing I do is I look at who are the 5 non-playoff teams, non-play-in teams in the East. Well, we know Charlotte's terrible. Orlando is all about the future. Detroit, even what they did with the Heat last night, they're willing. Kate Cunningham, I don't think coming back this season, so they're down also. So I see 3 definitive out of the play-in teams in Charlotte, Orlando, and Detroit. I see 3 right there. I see the Bulls wobbling to the point that they might look for value for DeMar DeRozan, Nikola Vucevic, and just say, hey, we gave up first-round picks for Vucevic to Orlando. We've got to recoup those. Maybe they make a move. So I could see that as your 4th team. Your 5th team of definitively not being in the playoffs in the Eastern Conference, I would have had Indiana there, but they're good, and they're having a good season right now, and I can't summarily write them off. I still think the Knicks will wobble to something not very good. I think with Bradley Beal missing time right now with the Washington Wizards, I would not necessarily overstate who they are. But that said, having trouble getting 5 teams for me to say, hey, they're not even a play-in team, yeah, I think the play-in could very much be a reality for the Miami Heat. And that's not good because that's 1 and done or 2 and done, and you're out of there. And that's where I think they have to really get out of this malaise. So all of that said, I also said the Heat have a soft upcoming schedule. Clippers, we don't know. It'll be a second night of a back-to-back regardless for the Clippers. They're in Orlando tonight. We'll see about Paul George and Kawhi Leonard. Then you have the Heat on Saturday hosting San Antonio, which has fallen off a cliff right now. They go out on a road trip next week. They're going to be playing games against Indiana, Oklahoma City, Houston, and San Antonio. Again, the soft spot. So after this break on redrecover.com Inside the Paint, I want to talk to Kurt Helin about the upcoming schedule and whether we should assume anything of this Miami Heat. I know I've gotten away from the chat board. We'll try to really do a lightning round on that also, even though I tend to be too long-winded. So we'll hit all of that up on our final segment on redrecover.com Inside the Paint after this brief commercial break. And welcome back to redrecover.com Inside the Paint. I'm Ira Winderman from the South Florida Sun-Sentinel. He's Kurt Helin from Pro Basketball Talk, NBCSports.com. If you missed either of our first two segments, you can catch them at all your Big O podcast outlets. Big O will be back right after our show today, talking Tua, Herbert, Dolphins, playoffs, and all the juicy bits. Right now, we're sort of talking about all the rancid bits after the Miami Heat's losses to the Memphis Grizzlies and the Detroit Pistons last night. I can't believe I'm even saying that. I can understand a road game at the end of a 4-game trip in Memphis, even if no one plays. Kurt, we know how the road is. You get tired after 8 days on the road. You look about coming home. They lost to the Detroit Pistons. They lost to a team that had won 6 games coming in, that was without their best player, that is not trying to win right now, that might have one of the worst rosters in the NBA right now, second worst record in the NBA. That still, even when I woke up this morning, is staggering. But I digress. We need to move on. I have been remiss in not going to the chat board. We will look at the Heat's upcoming schedule before we hand it back to Big O. Going to the chat board, MM asks, Ira, what trade can fix the Miami Heat? Bench scoring is a problem. Hero coming off the bench might be best, but I can't see them putting him on the bench. The old two-part question. Number one, obviously, there's going to be some Jay Crowder talk out there, but I really think if that was going to happen, it would have happened already. I don't think you can bench Tyler Hero. I don't think this is necessarily any of his fault. He had missed a bunch of time. He came back also. Kurt, when do you hit the trade panic button? Or like you said, when you're still only 3 games under 500, when you did lose without Jimmy Butler last night, when you've only had your core starting lineup start 8 games all season, do you just let it play out and hope naturally there's sort of an inertia to get you back on track?
Well, you're hoping for the inertia. It's panic isn't necessarily the word I'd go for, but I'd be pretty aggressive trying to find a deal for. I don't know that you're going to be able to, unless somebody really wants Duncan Robinson. I don't know where you're going to get shot creation.
Not even playing.
What you've got to
Duncan
offer.
Robinson's not even playing for a Heat team that can't win right now, so I just don't see what the attraction is. Plus, he has 3+ years left on his contract. That's a lot of money to absorb. You got to put in a sweetener. Kurt, one thing a reader at my Ask Ira at sunsentinel.com asked me, and I summarily dismissed it and didn't even run the question because I thought it was too extreme. Would you trade Caleb Martin for Jay Crowder? I know money has to fit in there also, but let's cap for a second. I'll give you a filler. Would you do that?
I'm leaning towards getting there. I don't know that I was there before, but this team needs a jolt. The problem is Jay Crowder isn't PJ Tucker. He's not as good. He's and Tucker
defensively,
especially defensively. He's just kind of a poor man's version, for lack of a better way of phrasing it. And by the way, that's including the PJ Tucker who does not shoot in Philadelphia. I don't know. That's a whole different discussion.
7 scoreless games in November.
Yeah.
Shocking. I mean, even for his low Heat production. Here's my issue with Caleb Martin, and I put this at AskIra at sunsentinel.com. With the Heat's bad contracts, Duncan Robinson, the $90 million 5-year deal, you certainly can look at, for the productivity, Kyle Lowry's 3-year, $85 million deal. It is so hard to find value contracts in the NBA and on the Miami Heat to a degree. Caleb Martin's under contract for 3 years at $20.3 million. That's a good contract. Whether you consider Caleb Martin a starter or a top 8 rotation player, if you're getting someone at less than $7 million a year, far less than the NBA average salary, Kurt, my point is this. You don't want to let the value contracts go. And so I think I would hold on to him simply because for the next 2 years, if you keep PJ Tucker, rather, I keep saying that, sorry, if you keep Caleb Martin, you're getting better value. Don't you have to think about the value contract of Caleb Martin when you talk about a trade, perhaps for a Jay Crowder?
The other part of that is Crowder's got to get paid. He is in the last year of his current deal. So if you're trading for him, unless you plan to rent him, and then Caleb Martin's a lot to give up for a rental.
Yes.
Now you've got to pay him and keep him and hope he kind of like PJ Tucker. Hope he stays healthy for the next
and Jay Crowder
3
will be
years, whatever it is.
and Jay Crowder will be a non-value contract. So I agree, you'll almost go in the other direction. That's why Phoenix had this sort of loggerheads. Like you said, they decided how are they going to spend their money. They decided that Cameron Johnson was a better long-term investment than Jay Crowder. If Jay Crowder wasn't starting, but got an extension from the Suns at big money, I think he would be fine. So this is about the money with Jay Crowder and his expiring deal. So you have that. Chase chimes in, do you think PJ Tucker was this big of a loss? I do, because I feel that someone who holds it all together, it's way more. PJ Tucker was never a statistics player. He was a glue guy. I wish Jimmy was the glue guy, but he's not there every night. I wish Kyle Lowry was the glue guy, but his age and his diminishing skills, I don't think he can be the glue guy. I do think that's a factor, so I'll handle that one on my own. This is one I don't like at all. Greater Good says the Heat was very patient with Lowry's personal issues. He hasn't returned the respect given him. Bull crap. He has shown up and played every single night, no matter the ailment. We talked about this in our first segment. You can catch it on our podcast. I think the fact that Kyle Lowry until last week was number 2 in the NBA, Kurt, in minutes played, I think is astounding. I think the want and the desire and the effort from Kyle Lowry is beyond reproach. Your thought?
I think Kyle Lowry is giving you everything he's got right now. It's just, it's not what it used to be, and it's maybe not what the Heat either expected or needed, but I don't think he's dogging it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a bit much. By the way, for those chiming in on Big O's super chat, I'm sure he thanks you. Every little bit helps. Carlos chimes in, this is not a surprise to me. The Heat have always have a down year every 4 or 5 years. Teams have windows. The Heat's window closed, and they have to retool. See, I think that's a good point you make, Carlos, here is it's interesting. 2020, the Heat, I know it's the bubble, go to the NBA Finals against the Lakers, if not injuries for Adebayo and Dragic. Who knows how that plays out within 2 wins of a championship. Come back the following year, they're a number 6 seed, sort of where they're trending this year. They play Milwaukee in the first round. They get ousted in the first round. They come back after that year, last year within a Jimmy Butler three-pointer of possibly going to the NBA Finals. Kurt, is that maybe somewhat typical of an older team that you get your legs, you lose your legs, you get your legs? And maybe that's what, when you decide to pay and play an older roster, that's what you're going to get from the Heat, that literally you need your gap years.
I still I don't love that, because I think you can be okay every year if you have the depth to get there. Like, you can rest Jimmy and you can keep guys fresh, but the lack of depth is preventing that. It's leading to that roller coaster instead of being able to survive those minutes well enough that you win enough games that you're in the mix still. It's hard to think that watching the game last night. Right? It's just hard to, I don't know. That was such a punch to the gut loss that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Mr. Spock chimes in, the Heat need depth and another starter, maybe in the wing. They have to add someone in the offseason. I think Martin and Strus are better off the bench. Is the lineup just not good enough? That even though you have Bam Adebayo and Jimmy Butler and Kyle Lowry and Tyler Hero, is it a matter of that you have good players but the chemistry isn't there? Or is it a matter of you have such a concentration in your starting lineup that you just don't have in-game balance?
It might be that. I think that's part of it, is that, and I was mentioning before, I just feel like if it's not Tyler or Jimmy creating the shot, that's not what Bam does. Bam is a finisher, right? Like, he's seemed to have run more isolations this year, and I haven't looked up the numbers, but like, he seems to be trying to create a little more, but that's never going. I mean, he might be better at it as he gets older and work on it, but that's not his strength. You've got 2 guys who can create shots. And if one of them isn't playing at any given minute or taking the night off, you're up against it. And defenses can load up on you. If you know it's just Tyler, I can load up.
Yeah, no, and again, and Tyler's not maybe the best version of himself when he's starting because he has to defer also. So I think that's part of the imbalance right here also. Let's see, going back here, Greater Good says, at least we're not hearing complaints about Duncan Robinson, because we're not hearing about Duncan Robinson at all. I don't know if that's good or not. You know what? I get a lot of times from the Heat, they say, you've got to understand where we were, what we had to pay, what we had to do, living in the moment and all of that. I do think the Duncan Robinson contract, though, was one that even in the moment, we had seen so many shooters paid before him, whether it was Joe Harris, whether it was Davis Bertans, and you just realize they're just 1-2 players. Kurt Helin, a guy who's written a lot of analysis over at Pro Basketball Talk at NBCSports.com also, was the one-dimensional shooter an overpay for the NBA in a period that the entire league has come to regret, because we're seeing guys like that get sort of eviscerated in the pick and roll, picked on. I mean, it's almost like we have this drinking game now when Duncan Robinson comes on, how soon till the first foul, and often it's within the first minute. Did NBA general managers, and they're all brilliant people, sharper basketball minds than you and I for sure, but did they get too caught up in the three-a-thon and think that, hey, everyone is Steph, everyone is Clay, and maybe all those shooters who got paid at the time, a lot of those really are looking right now like negative contracts.
Yeah. By the way, what the heck happened to Joe Harris, who might have been, to me, been the best of this group, because he did do some other things. Yeah. And wow, he has been flat out bad this year.
Yes.
Which is just hard to watch.
I think when you do the one-trick pony thing, you get into trouble with that. In other words, with so many of those players, with so many players in general, you say, okay, the shot's not there, but they're doing X, Y, and Z. They're playmaking, they're defending, they're moving the ball, they're rebounding. So let's go through this. Is Duncan Robinson going to defend?
No.
Is he really going to get in there, mix it up, and get you big-time rebounding numbers?
No, not really. Not, especially for his height, no.
Is he a great ball mover, assist, pick and roll kind of guy versus dribble handoff kind of guy?
Yeah, he's not. Yeah, he's not a creator. He's not put the ball in his hands and let him go.
So what I'm saying is it's all or nothing. So coaches always tell us, oh, you guys, you just look at the stats, you just look at the numbers, you have to get beyond that. The problem is with certain players, you can't get beyond that because that's who they are right now. Jimmy Bones goes, NBA stopped watching in the 70s. Here's the problem I have for the Heat. I still think they're playing too much in the 70s. I still think when they lose a game, 112, 108, they talk about how their defense wasn't good enough. You've got to score in today's NBA in order to win. Yeah. And I think that's a problem for the Heat right now. I think they still get a little bit caught up in winning on defense. I know defense can win. I know defense does win in the playoffs. But is a defensive mindset only enough Kurt Helin in today's NBA regular season to get a quality seed?
No, that's not. I mean, you have to have a balance on both ends. And last time I looked, I didn't look this morning, but a couple days ago, Heat were top 10 in defense. They were 9th or 10th. Like
they moved up to number 8 at one point when they were in Boston and they were getting it done. Absolutely.
So it's not a question of are they getting enough stops, but today's NBA, the true shooting percentage, the number of guys knocking down shots, the guys have gotten. What the analytics have done is gotten guys to take the shots they should take more. And you've got to be more efficient at it. And doing so means your guys have to be able to match that. And the Heat just haven't this year.
And it's interesting. You talk about an offensive-oriented lineup with Bam Adebayo, Jimmy Butler, Kyle Lowry, and Tyler Hero. And yet of all those guys, I think if they were the NBA best, honestly, I think only Tyler Hero is the kind of guy who could wind up a top 10 scorer because that's his bent. Jimmy much prefers to move the ball. Bam Adebayo relishes playing off the mid post, likes to move the ball and dribble handoffs. He likes that. Kyle Lowry, there are weeks he sometimes goes without shooting. And yet the way the game is right now, that's why you wind up in trouble right now, because you don't sort of have the balance. Too extreme goes, championship hopes are off the table. God, I hate on December 7th to say that. I know when you doubt the Heat, they wind up with the bubble year. They wind up being within a shot of the NBA Finals last season. But I guess I would put it this way. At least right now, it looks like their championship hopes for the season are off the table.
They are not near the class of Milwaukee and Boston right now. And more concerning, Ira, I don't really, at least for this season, I don't see how you get there. Both of those, Milwaukee just got Chris Middleton back. And promptly lost, but got Chris Middleton back. The best defender on the Celtics is yet to be able to suit up. Those two teams are getting better, and I don't see how the Heat match that.
See, Dallas says maybe you need Duncan Robinson back in the starting lineup because you have to have that 3-point threat. Thoughts?
I don't think, again, I'm back to, like I said earlier, I'm not sure anything should be off the table, but the downside of that is your defense has been really good and you just put a target out there.
Yeah, and we see it all the time. I just don't know how playable it is or not. Nizzle, hello Nizzle, says that the Heat's championship window with Jimmy Butler is closed. Jimmy Butler still has another 4 years, 3 years left on his contract. That's probably a bit extreme, Kurt Helin.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's closed. I just think you've got to – I don't think the pieces around him can get him to the position to take over a game like he did against Boston. Like those moments where you're like, that team.
Yeah, no, I still think that Pat Riley's been very good about taking care of his best players and putting players around them. So I still think the Heat are out there saying, how can we make this core better? And I still think Jimmy is sort of everything right now. I still think that Jimmy is their leading man and you still build around Jimmy because when you gave him that contract and you gave him that money and you gave them, like we mentioned earlier, that pay per game, you have to go there. You have to make a point of trying to make it work around Jimmy. Okay, I try to get to as many here. Thank you so much for chiming in on the chat board. We'll get to who we can. Upcoming schedule. Miami Heat Thursday night against the Los Angeles Clippers. Kurt, I'm going to ask you to be put on the spot. I know we'll see this during the day. You're Ty Lue. You have Kawhi Leonard. You have Paul George. You have guys you're probably not going to play on both nights of a back-to-back. No. My question to you, being LA-based, is there any chance both of those guys play both ends of the back-to-back? Number two, if you're Ty Lue, when do you think we will see Paul George, Kawhi Leonard? Will they play tonight against Orlando, Thursday against the Heat, one maybe in one game, one in the other? How do you think the Clippers approach going into this back-to-back and playing here at FTX Arena on Thursday night against the Miami Heat?
There is zero chance both of them play both. In fact, Kawhi and maybe Paul George, definitely not Kawhi. Tradition with the Clippers, Ty Lue's about as open with his starting lineups as Spoelstra, but tradition with the Clippers would be what the Heat tried to do with the Grizzlies, which is we can beat Orlando. Let's load up on Orlando. And whatever happens in Miami happens.
Right. So maybe interesting there. San Antonio, 5 o'clock for the international crowd here at FTX Arena on Saturday. The Spurs had the start of the season. We thought they would be Indiana-like, that heck, forget about the lottery. They're going for it. They've been terrible since. Thoughts on Heat Spurs on Saturday?
I have seen the Heat twice in person this year, Ira, and I just feel sorry for you. They're bad.
They're genuinely bad. The Spurs.
Yeah,
the
Spurs. I'm sorry. I mean, the Spurs twice in person.
I've seen the Heat 2 times in person. I feel bad for me, so I get that. The Heat,
the Spurs are genuinely bad.
If the Heat maximize their schedule, they have the Spurs this Saturday. A week from Saturday, they get the Spurs in Mexico City. So as long as they don't drink the water, as Kurt says, only eat the street food, they'll get 2 cracks at them. Then before we meet again next week, I think I'll be in Oklahoma City next Wednesday, the Heat play the Pacers. Originally when the schedule came out, I think we said, hey, Indiana, that's a W. Yeah. Pacers have been a hell of a story this season, haven't they, Kurt Helin?
And getting it from their rookies. Benedict might be, well, I mean, Banchero is probably the rookie of the year, but he's getting pushed. And then Nebhart, the point guard out of Gonzaga for 4 years, looks phenomenal for a couple of games in a row.
Years before that, I thought he was underutilized, misutilized at Florida. I think they made him less of a player than Chris Chiozza was for the Gators. I think that falls on the Gators. That's why they have a new coaching staff. But we'll handle Inside the Paint Gators edition another time. Right now we're running long. He's Kurt Helin. I'm Ira Winderman. This was RedRecover.com Inside the Paint. I'll talk to everyone next week from Oklahoma City, 9 a.m. on Wednesday. Until then, right now, the Big O Show rolls on.